We are going to talk to you tonight in a specific framework. The four of us tend to approach lesson planning, unit planning, and lesson planning from the perspective of something called understanding by design, which is something you might be familiar with. If not, we just wanted to go over this idea that the framework of that approach is to ask yourself first, what is it that I want students to know, or to be able to do, or to understand? And once you have kind of sort of identified that target or your desired result, then you think about, how will I know that they know what I want them to know? How will I know if they can do what I want them to be able to do? What would that look like? And you could think of that as sort of determining acceptable evidence to yourself. The last stage is to then think about what activities am I going to ask them to do and engage in so that I can get them to where I want to get them to go. Yes.
So you're talking about the backward design?
Yes,
right?
backwards design. Yep, exactly. So that, just to let you know, there are many ways to approach planning, lessons, curriculum writing. This is sort of the framework we're coming in with. And so you'll see that the activities we take you through tonight will be kind of nested in this sort of vision of lesson planning. So we're hoping that you kind of walk out of this with a couple of key ideas. Two really main ones. One is that lessons that promote really, really solid understanding in kids are built from strong objectives. You need to know what it is that you want your kids to know or to be able to do, your students. The second thing is that you need to be engaging your students in strong activities and tasks. And we're going to take some time tonight to help sort of define the characteristics of what makes an objective a strong objective, and what makes an activity or a task a strong one. And we're hoping that you'll kind of walk out of here with this idea that strong objectives are both measurable and specific, and that strong activities and tasks are what we would call rich and meaningful, and that they help to make student thinking visible. We're going to get deeper into this, but I wanted to sort of give you an idea of what was coming. I'm going to hand it over right now to Dan, who's going to sort of talk to you a little bit about what it might be like to write objectives for this unique situation that you're in. You have been learning content that is not directly the content that you are usually teaching your students, but you're going to try to bring it to your students. And Dan's going to talk to you a little bit about what that might be like.
So my main goal here is to provide a long introduction to rowing. But I'm going to give you some of the philosophy behind doing this work that we're trying to get you to do tonight. So I want to say first that I love to do this kind of work when I was a teacher. I would love to bring in outside worlds into my content, figuring out ways to bring robotics or engineering or amusement parks into my classroom in physics and mathematics. So the way that I want to have you think about this is that you have these two worlds right now. You have the TIP seminar, which provided you with backgrounds in origami engineering or history of Hollywood or healthcare robotics and all the other ones. The healthcare robotics and the rehabilitation robotics and the origami ones are the ones I know the best. But you have that world, which has all of the content behind it, and maybe a whole bunch of objectives and tasks that you could visualize. Like the professor that you've been working with has had objectives for your classroom, and they've had tasks or assessments that they've been working with you on. And then you have your own course, whatever you're teaching, and you have your own objectives in your lessons and your own assessments and tasks. And the idea is to take those two worlds and merge them together and figure out how we can construct some overlap. So I pointed out a couple of just random things here because they may or may not have to do with other things in the packet that we're doing later. But for example, you may be teaching a history course and you might want students to be able to identify and explain the causes of Bacon's Rebellion. And that might be something in your course that has a connection to state standards and tests. And in the TIP seminar, maybe you were learning about history of Hollywood, and you had to explain Hollywood perspective on class, right? On class, like what is Hollywood's perspectives on class or race or gender been throughout history? And and that's a connection to the outside world. That's something that everyone has a connection to. And let's take those two things and try to blend them. And maybe we're going to have students want to learn how film can be used as a way to study the causes of Bacon's Rebellion. And maybe you're going to have students write a film script about the causes of Bacon's Rebellion. So that's a way to bring these two worlds together. And there's a lot of other things I put up here that kind of bring those two disparate worlds together. So I believe that no matter what you're teaching, you can bring so much outside world into it, as long as you're creative about how you're going to integrate those two things. There's a lesson plan that's attached to your packet. We'll talk about it later, so don't look at it right now because you'll get lost. But there's a lesson plan that I did when I was a physics teacher that connected a roller coaster design to conservation of energy and centrifugal force, which it is kind of a natural thing, but I thought it was a good way to bring those two worlds together. So we're going to learn how to write an objective or two that allows you to link those two worlds together tonight, and then how to write strategies, how to create strategies that could help students. And by strategies, what we're going to be talking about all night, strategies, we mean both assessments and tasks. But strategies that could be used to achieve the objectives that we write tonight. So Rowan is going to introduce how to write objectives.
Thanks so much. So again, what we'll be doing here is something that might be really basic review for some of you. You might be doing this every day. For some of you, this might be totally new. Those are both totally fine. But I want to make sure that kind of everybody's on the same page as we do this kind of backwards design, understanding by design approach to writing objectives. And first, I just wanted to think about what often happens when you come out of an amazing seminar like this is you have this idea of like, hey, we could do this fun activity. It would be awesome. My kids would have fun. And then you do the activity and then you're like, oh, well, I wonder if they learned anything. And it's kind of the afterthought to it. And we would like to encourage you to move toward a model of, I'm just going to wait a second.
Unfortunately, we can't tell you to turn it down.
Yeah, I know, right? Turn down the volume. I hope you get where you're going really fast. To move toward an understanding by design or backward design model of starting with what you want students to know and be able to do, then developing a lesson to support those goals, then implementing the lesson, and then assessing progress toward those objectives that you've planned out from the beginning so that you have a plan in mind, both of what you want them to know and be able to do and how you're going to know that they're doing that. And when we say assess, this doesn't mean like a unit exam, but it might be like, how are you going to see students thinking in an ongoing manner while you're going through? Maybe it's exit slips, maybe it's key points that you need to see during a discussion, maybe it's the completion of the project where you can see these, 5 key pieces of understanding in their final projects, but to be thinking in that manner. And I just want to start us with a quote here. Can I get a volunteer to read?
Begin with the hypothesis that any subject can be taught effectively in some intellectually honest form to any child at any stage of development. Jerome Bruner?
Mm-hmm. And I really love this quote because it's something that's really guided my thinking. I told some of you earlier my most recent teaching position was actually as a preschool director. And I did a lot of science investigations with my 3- and 4-year-olds that most people don't expose their students to until middle or high school. So I've got some students here. We spent about 2 weeks looking at different environments for yeast to grow in water with sugar, with salt, that's cold, that's warm, that had dirt in it. We tried a lot of things to see what those little yeast were doing, and we could measure their growth by how much these balloons inflated. And they were doing legitimate scientific investigation in a measurable, intentional format before they could read or write. And I just want to kind of, have a few more examples of my kids doing this in here, just to kind of get your wheels spinning about there are intellectually honest ways that your third graders can engage with origami education, like origami folding geometry or GIS mapping, and like thinking about what that looks like. Here's another example. We rubbed pieces of bread around things around the school and made predictions about which ones were going to grow the most bacteria when we left them in bags for a couple weeks. They are really disgusting. I'm not sure if you can see that, but amazing. So kind of getting into that, we're asking first, what does it mean to understand something? And a few different people have thought about this. There's a good chance you've seen these before, but just kind of as a refresher, one of them is Bloom's taxonomy. And both of these kind of start from the bottom and work up. So at kind of the lowest stage with Bloom's, you might know something. When he says no, he means you can kind of like recite that fact back. And again, this kind of comprehension is like, oh, kind of I've like gotten what you said to me, but what are you doing with it? Webb's depth of knowledge calls this the recall phase. So it's kind of like, do you know what 3 times 5 is? Either you know what it is or you don't, but you're not necessarily doing anything with it. You move up to being able to apply, or what Webb calls this kind of skill and concept level, then analysis, and finally synthesis and evaluation or extended thinking. And that's where you, if we go back to the 3x5 example that I just gave up, maybe you can explain how 3x5 works as a group of 3 5s or 5 groups of 3. Maybe you can draw that as an array. Maybe you can explain how that is equivalent to repetitive addition. 5 plus 5 plus 5 is the same thing as 3 times 5. And then maybe you can take that out of that context of not just applying it, but synthesizing and evaluating it, looking at strategies that other people have used. How have those worked? So again, I know this is review for most of you, but just we'll be thinking about these different levels and using them with intention. You might just want your students to recall something, and that's okay, but you want to be also pushing it sometimes toward that extended thinking and knowing which one you want and when you want it and why you want it. This is also Wiggins and McTagg from Understanding by Design. They were only interested in that uppermost level. So when you get to that level 4, 5, 6, what does it mean to truly understand something? And their sense of that is that you should be able to explain something. So that kind of sense of like, you were teaching this to one of your friends who've never heard of it. That you can interpret the information. So again, they give a lot of different senses of like, if you're reading 2 different pieces about this, can you interpret the meaning from them? Where are their contradictions? How do you make sense of those? That you can apply it in a variety of different contexts, that you can see with perspective, that you can understand your perspective, your peers' perspective, that you can integrate or come to terms with those, or make a reasonable argument. That they should reveal self-knowledge, so having that sense of what do I understand or misunderstand, where do I need to grow? And also they put an emphasis on show empathy. For them that was really important. And that's kind of understanding, if I'm looking historically, why did this author write in this way, for what reason? And I'm standing here as a middle school student in 2018, and I have the empathy to not only understand my friend who's arguing with me, but also this author from the 15th century, putting yourself in other people's shoes. And also while we're here, just because it's fun, this is one of my 4-year-old's drawings of what electrons do in a closed circuit from our robotics unit, where they built a robot with light up eyes and pincher arms. So those are my buddies. They can't write yet, so you have to write what they say, but they got it down. So now kind of digging into like the grit of writing good objectives, the chances are that you might have spent a lot of time saying students will be able to do whatever it says in the textbook. Found the objective, there it is, and then I copy it, and now I'm ready to go. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The chances are the people who wrote your textbook probably spent a lot of time thinking through very carefully what your students might be doing each day, so that by the end of the year, They would meet all of these larger objectives. They're using an understanding by design or backwards design framework to do this. You want to be a critical reader of that, but we're not panning that approach. However, there isn't a textbook for how to teach, robotics and healthcare to your 6th graders. And so we're going to need to move outside of that space. And the 2 key parts that we're looking at here is objectives as being measurable and specific. So I have 2 objectives here. Students will be able to, and the students will be able to be. We'll just call them A and B. I'd like to give you a minute to read them both and just think about what the second one offers that the first one didn't. So take a minute to read them and then chat with a partner.
Well, she's.
Would anybody like to share anything that they've noticed? Any thoughts or feedback? Yes.
Well, first objective is just vague, too vague. All right, in objective, you want your objective as much as you can to be measurable. Some kind of, how will you know if students met the objective? So when you write the objective, you also put in there how you want to know that they were able to do it.
We planted him there. All right, other thoughts?
Just to kind of piggyback off of that, the first one definitely very vague. The second one is more actionable. It's really specific, and it tells you what the teacher and the students are going to be doing in the lesson, and then also why, more or less. And if you kind of read in between the lines, it also tells you that what you're doing specifically, it's not just like analyzing film clips, but specifically from Mary Pickford, and then it also tells you that there's some connection there between her, Hollywood, and World War I, so that gives context for the lesson too.
I'm going to give somebody else a chance first and then come back to you. It's really important. Hang on. Yep.
And also, if you just look at in addition to what has already been said, to know is that lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy, and to analyze is all the way almost to the top.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, and like, if I was writing this, the second one, I would add another sentence, and the sentence that I would add, okay, I was add a sentence that will indicate how students will show me, so they're analyzing the film and explain, well, then I'm going to put in there, students will write a paragraph that does what that explains. Students will put in writing their opinion or facts substantiated from the reading or something or another. I mean, I actually have to put a little piece in there that they're gonna show me that they get it. Okay, because if I just let that be, many of my students will pretend that they're ready. They will sit there. All right, so I have to engage them. So I want to get something out of it, and that's something that they can articulate, and then we can build on it. All right. Okay, so I want to do something.
Yeah. And actually, I'm going to jump on this before I hear yours. One thing that we will mostly be doing here, because we're going to do this in 2 stages, starting with the objectives and then looking at strategies, is initially think about what do we want them to know and be able to do by the end. So we want them to analyze and explain. And the second part that we're going to be doing is, I hear you saying like they should write a paragraph, but it could be a discussion, or it could be making a film, or it could be that they're going to turn and talk to their neighbors, but you're going to walk around, or it could be an exit ticket. So as we're kind of going through that, we're going to save that, like, how do we see it for the second part? Because what you said was spot on, but right now you're being asked to, by tip, write some objectives and separately write some strategies, if I understand correctly. And that sounds like something that is a great idea, but we'll probably end up in that strategy section. Doesn't mean that you can't put it, because everybody's got their own way of doing things, and everything you're doing is great. But we'll probably be focusing mostly in this, the part about objectives on like, what are they, like what's the level of thinking, what's the level of understanding we want them to demonstrate, and then After that, thinking about what would it look like if they were demonstrating it? A paragraph would be a good way to demonstrate that. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, something I picked up from writing IEPs was using SMART goals, S-M-A-R-T, specific, measurable, attainable, reasonable, and time specific. So that's something I usually translate into my lesson objectives, and this pretty much covers all of that. I mean, time specific is pretty much understood as within the lesson time frame. So that makes a lot of sense.
Excellent. That's a great one.
It seems like the real nut of the whole thing is that you're addressing the Common Core standard. So you're taking what is going to be, what's the right word, expeditious in your school, you know you need to teach it anyway, it's sustainable, it will make your curriculum more sustainable because you're actually addressing something that you're probably required to do anyway. But you're doing it through the lens of this new content area. So that second objective directly addresses the standard.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up. A lot of you are going to be working from the standards, and as you're going through, you might or might not want at this time, you probably know the standards very well for your grade and subject if you are teaching a standards-based course. But be thinking about, are there those standards that this is going to meet? Because that's what you're going to be bringing back to your principals or your coaches, and also, writing on your board. Some of you don't have those, but you're going to have course objectives. If you're a history teacher, you might have, what do my students need by the end of the year? Maybe they're taking the AP exams, or maybe you simply mapped out a course. So where does this fit in there? But yeah, that's really important, and pretty much anything that you are doing in this kind of Jerome Bruner idea of we can teach anything with intellectual honesty at any age is going to fit in with some of your standards. I'm going to show us one more and just give you a minute to think about it silently, because I don't think that there's very much more for you guys to add because you already are doing this so well, but just give everybody a minute to read one more example. So this is the last thing that I'm going to leave you with before you go into working on your own, but with your group nearby to start thinking about some objectives, is just this action words from Bloom's taxonomy. It's the next page in your packet. You've probably seen them quite a bit before, but as you're thinking about writing objectives, you're just thinking about replacing words, actually I'm going to go back, words like understand, which could mean anything on that list, to words like use triangle relationships to determine, or other more specific words that you might choose from that list, or would be pulling from your course content. So that's just another tool to have. And I will now ask you to flip to the back of that packet and just tear off the last page. And like this. Tear it off. Yep, tear it off. Because you'll be writing on this one, but referring back to some of the other pages at different points. And right now what I'm going to do is invite you to, and you might want to go back to your kind of brainstorms from the beginning of this session, just fill out these top 3 boxes with an objective for one lesson that you might do. This might be a 3-day lesson, but just focus on one objective that you're interested in, and start by thinking about what is one piece of content for my seminar that I'd like to share with my students. How does that match with a state standard or an articulated goal for my course? Where is the overlap between those two? You don't need to find the standard number, although if you want to whip out your computer and do that, you're welcome to. And then work on writing a specific and measurable objective where you might be using the Bloom's action words.
So, fast forward a week from now or a day from now, however long it takes you, you will have some really, really rich objectives. You're excited about what your students are going to learn and how they're going to implement these ideas that you've been learning on this campus into the campus where you normally live. Right, objectives are a wonderful starting place. Then there's the thing that they actually have to do, which in TIPS language is strategy. How do we actually get to those amazing paragraphs or those wonderful designs that we want to see? It's going to take a number of days, and in each day we want strong activities and tasks. And what makes those tasks and activities strong is they need to be rich and meaningful, and they also need to be visible. We're going to talk about those components in a moment. You all, again, have expertise. I'm sure you have your own ideas about what is a rich and meaningful task for my students. We've taken a stab at putting a list up here. This is our brainstorm. It's not the definitive list. But for the sake of moving along, I'm going to put up this list. Feel free to mentally supplement it or subtract from it. When we think about rich and meaningful work, the type of work we really want our students to engage with, this is in your packets on page 5. We want our students doing work that is essential and authentic, essential to our courses. So going back to the type of things that are our standards or Common Core standards or wherever we're drawing our course structures from, the type of things that our students and ourselves are already being asked to do. But then authentic, things that go beyond just what the textbook says or just what the state is saying and affect students' lives. So we're looking for that happy marriage between what we're being asked to do and what we care about in students' lives. We want things that are equitable, so all of our students are able to do these tasks. Maybe the richest task is throwing down some Immanuel Kant. But we know that not all of my 9th graders can read Immanuel Kant, so we need to talk about how we're building a bridge towards that. Immanuel Kant, philosopher, famously, when his work just came out, there are stories of philosophy students committing suicide because of complexity. So maybe not something we're dropping on 9th graders unaided. Low floor, high ceiling, so everybody can get in on this work, but our highest, fastest readers, whatever, are able to be pushed as far as they can go. How do we get to do that? How do we get to these rich things? We need clarity in our instruction. Students can't be confused about what we're asking them to do or how to do it. We need our students to be active. Sitting and listening isn't going to get that done. They're not going to become better writers from hearing me talk about writing, although I love to talk about writing. Their work needs to be visible. So let's get to what you were talking about in terms of paragraph. I need to know how my students are progressing so I can help them. A lot of times my students would say, I don't feel like writing today. That's fine, I get that. I usually don't feel like writing. But I can't help you if I don't know what you're thinking. This would be so much easier with mind control, mind reading abilities. We're going to talk about a number of ways or hopefully you'll generate a number of ways to create that visibility. And then that validation part is really important. We're not just learning what our students are thinking. If our students are doing work and if they're putting their ideas out in our classrooms, that's that active vulnerability. It's important that we are responding to them as quickly as we can. We're human. It's not going to be immediate. But when a student says a great answer, I want to let them know, that was a great answer because you cited the evidence from the text and you connected it to the prior learning. I'm validating your answer, and I'm also letting other students know, whoa, that was a great answer because he did ABC. If I do ABC, maybe I too will have a great answer. And sometimes I have to say, Dan, that is actually wrong. And that's real feedback too, and there are nice ways to do it. You all are already nice. Probably, I don't know, you seem nice. I know the question that's been on everyone's mind, the reason you came here today is what's in that second packet. Let's talk about that second packet. The second packet, if you don't have it, just raise your hand, we'll get it to you. It
No,
says,
I'm talking about, we don't have it yet.
that's page
Oh,
5.
it's on page
Yes,
5.
I want to talk about this lesson plan examples packet. What's in this packet is examples of lesson plans. We thought that it was important that you leave not just with some ideas, but also with some examples. Before we go through it, I'm going to walk you through it because everyone writes lesson plans in a different style. The reason that there's 2 lesson plans in here is to try to be, to acknowledge that you've got a different style. I'm not saying this is the way to write the lesson plan. This is an example of a lesson plan. And if you look at it, if you flip to it right now, I would bet $1 it's not going to make a lick of sense. So I'm going to walk through it because everyone's got a different style, and if you don't know the style, it's going to be confusing. Especially if you're not an 11th grade history teacher. This is an 11th grade history lesson. It's about Bacon's Rebellion. Sounds delicious. Actually, it was not delicious. It was the moment in colonial America, in Virginia, where for a moment, just like 30 seconds of American history, we saw lower income, actually indentured white servants link with enslaved African Americans. So it was they shared a class identification and they rebelled and they lost. And then there were laws made separating whites and blacks. It's an important moment in American history. It is the creation of legal segregation. I want my students to know about that. This goes back even before there was an America. This is colonial days. But how am I going to get my students to that? I need a good lesson plan. So this is a good lesson plan, not the good lesson plan. If you would turn with me to page 1, page 1 is just a really elaborate version of an objective. That is all you're seeing on page 1. You see, we're under where it says objective, you see that first box on the left. I'm sorry, we should blow this up. It says skill/content. Those are the things I want my students to know. You can see I'm using the Bloom's verbs. Under assessment, it's got that piece of how will I know if they know what I want them to know. And then the criterion for success even breaks down that assessment. I want a paragraph, and here's what needs to be in that paragraph. We're going to give you time to read on your own. I just want to show you how this works. It's important to note before we turn to the next page, this is coming from a school where teachers co-plan. So one person is writing this for 4 teachers to teach. Probably it's going to have more detail in it than you need if you're writing for just yourself. So if you look at this and think 8 pages, I'm not writing 8 pages for my lesson on Tuesday. That's probably fine. You probably can hold a lot of this in your head, and you probably don't need to. But if you're just handing this to someone else to go walk into a classroom and teach, you probably want to write it all down. That's what this person did. It's not even my plan. That's all. From Art, he's a nice guy. He's okay with it. Please turn to page 2 with me. In page 2, there's 2 columns. On the left-hand column, it's kind of grayed out a little bit. And what we're seeing there is 3 things. 1, there's the name of the part of the lesson we're in. We're in the launch. Then there's a number. That is how long I want to spend on my launch. I want to spend 5 minutes on my launch. Then there's a second number, which is how much of class should have gone by. So if I spent 5 minutes on my launch, by the time I'm done, it should have taken 5 minutes. This starts to get interesting when we get to the next one, where we see independent practice. I want students to work for 8 minutes. 8 plus 5? 13. Roughly 14. 13. Yeah, it's 13. So that's what's happening in the left-hand column. Left-hand column, somewhat interesting. More interesting, I think, is what's going on in the white boxes here. There's a lot of writing, and I'm going to let you take time to work through it, but I'm going to suggest that you focus on the independent practice sections. That's plural. There's 2 independent practice sections in this plan. There's one on page 2, and there's a second independent practice that begins at the bottom of page 3. So the question I want to put in your mind is, we said strong tasks and activities are all of these things. And I'm telling you, I think this is a good lesson plan. Which means I think this lesson plan shows evidence of the things on the board. Most of you have taught longer than me and are everything except taller than me. So you may not agree with me, and that's fine, and you're probably right about it. But I want to ask you, to what extent do you think this lesson plan has evidence of those things? To what extent does it not have evidence of those things? What would you use from this style of planning? What would you not use from this style of planning? This is an object for you to critique. I'm not telling you this is how it has to be done. Last thing I'm going to tell you before I let you actually read. This is a very text-heavy lesson. There's a lot of reading in this lesson, and you might look at these questions and be like, I'm not a history teacher. I don't know about Bacon's Rebellion. I don't know if that's a good question. Fair. I've included the readings starting on page 7. You don't have to do all the readings. I'm not going to check to know if you know your Howard Zinn at the end. I mean, you probably should, but you don't have to, but just as a place for you to reference. So feel free to, I don't know your working style. If you work better on your own, do that. If you work better talking with someone near you, do that. The questions are, to what extent does this lesson plan represent those values? And what would you do like this, or what would you not do like this? I'm going to stop talking for 10 minutes, which is physically painful for me. And then I'll call you back and we'll have a little bit of discussion, and I promise we'll be done saying things to you before that 6 o'clock. We're only going to be able to have 3 people share either something that they would take from this or something that they would not take from this.
Hello.
Hi. just gonna go 1, 2, I'm gonna do 4. So 1, 2, 3.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was discussing how I really appreciated how he built in before the end of the unit, formative assessment that allowed him to say if most don't have it right, this is what we're gonna do. If half have it right, this is what we're gonna do, and most have it right. And it's not just at the end, like it's midway through the lesson, so you can guide toward the course. And you said, because I had prior discussed it with you, that right, at the end, you will get exit tickets that are virtually probably gonna be right on. spot on.
The thing I know about reading my students' essays, they turn in an essay, I got 120 of them to read, takes me 3 weeks. By the time I write all the things, they no longer have any memory of doing this, they've never seen these words before. So my goal is always to, like, whatever feedback I'm gonna give, I want to give it in the classroom before they leave the room. In fact, I want to try to give them feedback before they do the exit ticket, because even then it's another day. So it's about getting there as quick as possible. Yeah.
So as far as seeing evidence of this, I saw evidence of everything. My only critique was the equitable part for diverse learners. Like I didn't know the backstory of this being one of those types of schools where everybody is doing something from 9th grade all the way to 12th. But for my 5th graders, they would need a lot of backstory on this. And I use Google Drive, so when it comes to the feedback is like computer to computer. They see me typing in, and they see where I'm asking them to indent, and I'm asking them to do X, Y, Z. But yeah, this would be something that I would have to adapt and modify and, accommodate for the kids with IEPs.
And this is an AP course. So if you look at the reading level, I taught 9th grade. I didn't teach this AP course. I taught 9th grade. I wouldn't give them these readings. I would still have in terms of the planning piece, I'd still have plans about what if I see this in the classroom, I'll do this, I'll do X, Y, Z. But the reading and writing expectations.
Yeah, we kind of figured it was AP also because I didn't see a space where there was vocabulary that the kids needed to know prior to all of this.
Yeah, and that's important. So thank you.
I think it was, okay.
I think you were.
Mine was about the laughs and the comments as well, which I really liked. The only thing is you have 5 minutes for it, but if they're at the most don't have it right, that's certainly going to take longer than if most have it right. So I usually like a range of minutes, just in case. And usually then, you're taking every single minute and the next day.
Couldn't say anything better, that's what.
I like the skeletal structure of it. As far as the details and everything, I can adjust them to differentiate with my students, but as far as the way it's put together, how you allotted the time, I can change all of that, but I think the structure is really doable, especially if you share it with someone else. It has a lot of details about how you go about and the expectations, so I like it, it's nice.
My hope is it is something that you see use in. If you don't, that is entirely fine. We did want to give you multiple representations, so if you keep flipping, I think it's, I want to say page 9, you can see a series of science plans that Dan put together. That's for a different group of students in a different context, and those are plans that you were writing to implement yourself. So that may be more similar to the circumstances you're writing for TIP in. We're not going to have time to read them as a group, but you have them to take home and hopefully chew on.
And Dan, you're just going to say something briefly?
Yeah, just because you have them, I want to give you some context for them. So the way that I would offer my lesson plans is as a unit. So I very rarely struck one standalone lesson that only connected to the day before and the day after. I would write a lesson that connected to a whole unit where there were labs associated with it and projects associated with it, and it was a kind of an ecosystem of learning going on. So I included a whole unit I did on conservation of energy, and that first page kind of goes through what the enduring understandings and essential questions are for that unit, which involves 4 lessons, 2 labs, and 1 overarching project. And I included the project, the rubric for that project, lessons, And what I would often do is I would have an introduction lesson, I would introduce the project, and then I would have multiple lessons that fed that project. This is kind of my modified version of project-based learning, which I think is very, very hard to do if you do it real. But I was introducing topics that came up so they could start attacking different parts of that project. So in that lesson, I'm talking about conservation of energy, and then how you calculate different parts of energy, and then centripetal force. So you have to determine G levels of a roller coaster going down a hill and up over a hill. Kind of got into all of the details. And at the end, they had to do a full presentation and actually build a roller coaster and calculate all of the speeds and energies and G-forces of the roller coaster. So that's just, it's a very different lesson plan structure than the one Lightning gave. But there you go.
So how long did this take? Is it like a whole semester? Like a
No.
what is it, over a month?
2 weeks.
2 weeks? 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yep.
He was at Central.
Oh.
No, I mean, each of those lessons is one lesson period. And then the lab was one period, and then project, I would have a couple of periods that we would just work on the project. That was about 2 weeks.
Now, how long were your periods? Was it a standard period or a double period? Or?
They were, well, standard period Central is 55 minutes.
I'll mention one more thing about the lessons as you're looking at them. The next thing that I believe you need to turn in is strategies, objectives and strategies. And I usually think of strategies as meaning something different than what TIP is kind of using them as.
Yes.
And so there's a feature in each of these that we think might be what you would be looking for when TIP is asking you for strategies, which is more or less these lesson summaries or the key ideas. They're on the bottom of page 1 or the entirety of page 10. More or less this tracking through of like what is happening in the lesson that is clear, that is measurable, where you're not mapping out every single, word and section of it, but kind of this. So stage 3 lesson plan on page 10, like this lesson 1 kind of 2-sentence summary might be a strategy that you turn in next week for TIP. Lesson 2, students calculate the potential of kinetic energy at several points in a roller coaster track that includes 2 hills and a vertical loop. That is our sense of what a TIP strategy might be. More or less a summary of what the task is going to be for your lesson.
What's a task and assessment?
A task with that embedded assessment, that way of knowing, making the learning visible and what they will be doing to engage with that. On page 1, this kind of like key tasks at the bottom seems to be similar to what TIP is asking you for when you're talking about strategies. So have students read this and annotate key information, write a sentence summarizing the main points. Like that's kind of a strategy that you might use, is like this annotation, and summarizing with 2 or 3 sentences is another strategy that you might be thinking about as you're turning in your work for TIP.
Okay, so the activity that we would have done with you had we not run out of time, sorry about that, is to have you go back to the content from your TIP seminar that you're trying to marry with something that you're already needing to do in your class, and you wrote a nice objective for it. We would then get you to start thinking about what strategies would you do. And so there's the bottom half of the page that you were working on really asks you to think about what task or activity would I have my students do? And then to ask you to hold yourself accountable. How is it rich and meaningful, this activity that you've chosen? You can go back to that list that we provided, or you can think about your own characteristics of what makes things rich and meaningful. And also ask you to hold yourself accountable for how it's going to help you make student thinking visible. And we will hang around after if you would like to, while your brain is kind of in this place of the objective you wrote, if you want to try to do this and you want some guidance, or you can sort of go out thinking about it and go on your own. But before before everybody leaves, I just wanted to close by asking you to say, I'm gonna just ask, we're gonna sort of whip around the room, and I want you to say one thing that we worked on today that you're still gonna be thinking about as you start to write your plans up. So think for just a minute, and when you're ready, just give me a thumb so I have a sense of. So one thing that we worked on today or talked about today that you're still gonna be thinking about as you walk out this room and head into writing your plans.
Okay, one thing that I'm going to be thinking about as I start to write up my unit is the types of strategies that I can address using Bloom's taxonomy higher level.
Thanks.
I'm just still thinking about what types of standards I think I can connect to material.
Thanks.
I think I'm still processing all the things, but I'm still not sure what I'm teaching yet. So all the things are still working. They'll probably come into place once I decide what the lessons are. But I don't know.
Bob, how about you?
Well, I already figured that I'm going to be using this handout, having it sitting right there by my computer, okay, as I begin my process. I like the list of action words, vocabularies. I'm going to be pondering this as I start to write my action strategies of what my kids are going to be doing. All right. And I already started writing, and I already made reference to the web of knowledge and Bloom's taxonomy. I'm trying to figure out a way, or trying to talk that what we're going to be doing with this origami is going to help students in their standardized Keystone assessments. So all the time I'm trying to look and say, okay, how can this help students do better on their standardized assessments that we have, even though we fully pay.
You're really working to look for that connection that Dan
Yeah.
was talking about in the beginning. That's great. Thanks, Bob. Yeah.
So I guess I'll be thinking about the backwards design. For all my other units, I've had one major idea that connects everything, but I think with the origami, we're all like, can't really just, so where is it gonna fit in?
Great. Thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of things. One thing I'm thinking about how to make my objective more measurable and physical, like what it's gonna look like, and also how to connect to the standards. And
Excellent. Thank you.
I appreciated the list, the characteristics of strong tasks, so we're going to be spending a lot of time on making sure that my tasks are strong.
Excellent. Thank you.
I created one of my objectives, and it's tied to my state standards, and I was able to use words from Bloom's taxonomy from the evaluate and create columns, and I really want to focus most of my objectives on those two. I know that like knowledge and understanding are necessary components of lesson plans, but for this, I really want to try and keep the tasks more meaningful and like towards the higher level of Bloom's taxonomy.
Go ahead.
Yep, very similar to other people too, just honing that backward design. Really why I got into TIP was to really improve my planning, so this is a good one.
Thank you.
So I'm going back to my rationale and my background, and I'm going to think about strengthening my measurable objectives, so that way, once I get to objectives and strategies, it'll be easy to write.
We'll slide to the middle and then go over.
Sure. So I'm going to be thinking about writing objectives that are actionable, essential, and authentic. And I think that will drive everything else that I do.
Okay.
Once I leave, I'm going to be thinking about I really want to do a hands-on something, and I have to connect engineering with math, so I'm going to be looking at the best way to connect this hands-on thing that's kind of going around in my head.
I'll be thinking about how to, well, a good model from our project-based learning. Yes, so I got a good example.
Awesome.
Thanks. Good start.
I need to make sure that my activities and tasks properly measure the background knowledge and so that they have the skills and recall necessary to do the more abstract actual building and designing and creating. So making sure that there is this wrong.
Nice. Great. Go ahead.
For me, it's diving into a specific event or topic that I want to cover so I can bring out all these larger things.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Our emails are on the front of the packet. You can email any of us. And please feel free to hang around if you want to try out extending your objective into some sort of task strategies. Okay?
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.